Welcome back to Sleepy Facts. Take a slow breath. Relax your mind. Rest smarter as we gently drift into tonight's story. If you'd like more quiet stories like this, you are welcome to subscribe. And if there is a topic you want to hear next, just whisper it in the comments. Tonight, we travel back to the beginning of words, to a time before language, before stories could be told, before names existed for anything. Imagine a world where humans lived without the ability to say, "I love you," or "Look at that sunset," or "Let me tell you what happened." A world of gestures and grunts, of pointing and facial expressions, but no words to capture the thoughts swirling in increasingly complex minds. Close your eyes and picture our ancestors, perhaps 200,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa. They look like us. Their brains are the same size as ours, with the same structures, the same potential. But they don't speak as we do. Not yet. They have some form of communication, certainly. All social animals do. Calls to warn of danger, sounds to express emotion, but not language as we know it. Not the infinite combinations of sounds that can express any thought, any feeling, any observation about the world. The story of how language began is shrouded in mystery. There are no fossils of words, no ancient recordings, no written records from that distant time, because writing wouldn't be invented for another 190,000 years or more. We must piece together the story from fragments, from anatomy, from archaeology, from studying how the brain works, from observing how children learn to speak, from comparing human language to animal communication. Scientists have debated for centuries how language began. Some thought it emerged suddenly, a genetic mutation that rewired the brain. Others believed it developed gradually, growing more complex over hundreds of thousands of years. The truth, as we're discovering, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Language required biological changes in our anatomy and brain, but it also required cultural transmission, the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation, the slow accumulation of complexity. Before there could be language, there had to be the physical ability to produce complex sounds. Our ancestors had to evolve the anatomy that makes speech possible. This happened over millions of years, long before language itself emerged. Early hominins, our ancient relatives, had vocal tracts similar to modern apes. The larynx, the voice box, sat high in the throat. This allowed them to breathe and swallow simultaneously, reducing the risk of choking. But it limited the range of sounds they could produce. Over time, as our lineage evolved, the larynx descended lower in the throat. This created a larger space above it, the pharynx, which acts as a resonating chamber. This anatomical change gave our ancestors the ability to produce a wider variety of sounds. But it came with a cost. With the larynx lower, the pathways for breathing and swallowing now crossed. This is why humans can choke on food, why we must be careful when eating. Evolution traded some safety for the ability to speak. The descended larynx appears in fossils of Homo heidelbergensis, a human ancestor that lived between 600,000 and 200,000 years ago. This suggests the anatomy for speech was in place long before modern humans appeared. But anatomy alone doesn't create language. A parrot has anatomy that can produce human sounds, yet parrots don't have language. They can mimic, but they don't understand grammar or generate novel sentences with meaning. The brain had to change too. Humans have brain regions specialized for language that are either absent or much smaller in other primates. Broca's area in the frontal lobe is crucial for producing speech and understanding grammar. Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe is essential for understanding the meaning of words. These regions are connected by neural pathways that allow them to work together. Damage to these areas impairs language in specific ways, showing that language processing is localized in the brain. But when did these language-specific brain structures evolve? Brains don't fossilize, so we can't examine ancient brains directly. But skulls do fossilize, and the inside of the skull preserves some information about the brain that once filled it. Endocasts, casts made from the inside of skulls, show that the general pattern of brain asymmetry seen in modern humans, with language areas larger on the left side, was present in early Homo species, possibly as far back as 2 million years ago. This suggests that the neural foundations for language are ancient, much older than language itself. The brain structures that would later support language may have originally evolved for other purposes, perhaps for processing complex tool use, which also involves sequential actions and fine motor control, similar to speech. Over time, these structures were co-opted, exapted, for the new function of language. Genes also play a role. In 2001, scientists discovered a gene called FFOXP2 that, when mutated, causes severe language and speech difficulties. People with this mutation can understand language but struggle to produce speech and to learn grammar. The gene is found in many species, but the human version differs from that in chimpanzees by just 2 amino acids. These tiny changes occurred in the last few 100,000 years, possibly contributing to our unique language abilities. But FOXP2 isn't a language gene in any simple sense. It's involved in the development of neural circuits throughout the brain, not just in language areas. It affects motor control, including the fine control of the mouth and throat needed for speech. It's part of a complex genetic network that builds the brain, rather than a single switch that turns language on or off. So the biological foundations for language, the anatomy, the brain structures, the genetic changes, were laid down over millions of years. But when did language itself emerge? When did our ancestors first use words? This is the great mystery. There's no clear threshold in the archaeological record, no moment where we can say, here, this is when they started talking. Some researchers argue that language is very ancient, perhaps appearing with Homo erectus almost 2 million years ago. They point to the complex tools and long-distance migrations of these early humans as evidence of sophisticated communication. Others argue that language is relatively recent, appearing only with modern humans around 200,000 years ago or even later. They point to the explosion of symbolic artifacts, art, jewelry, musical instruments, appearing around 40,000 years ago as evidence of the cognitive shift that made language possible. The truth may be that language didn't appear in a single moment, but emerged gradually. Perhaps early hominins had simple proto-languages with small vocabularies and minimal grammar. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these proto-languages became more complex, more expressive, more efficient. Cultural evolution the passing down of linguistic innovations from generation to generation, drove this increasing complexity. What were the first words? We can never know for certain, but we can speculate based on what we know about language and human needs. The earliest words were probably concrete, referring to things in the immediate environment. Words for food, for water, for danger. Words for family members, mother, father, child. Words for common animals, for useful plants, for tools and weapons. Many of these early words may have originated as imitations of natural sounds, onomatopoeia, where words sound like what they describe. The word for water might have sounded like water flowing. The word for a certain animal might have imitated its call. This kind of iconic relationship between sound and meaning would have made words easier to learn and remember in the absence of a rich existing language to build upon. Other words may have emerged from gestures, pointing at something while making a sound, repeatedly, until the sound alone became associated with the thing. This co-speech gesture, combining vocalization with physical movement, may have been a crucial step in the transition from gesture-based communication to fully vocal language. Even today, we gesture when we speak, especially when trying to explain something complex or when speaking to someone who doesn't share our language well. Grammar, the system of rules for combining words, would have developed more slowly. The first words were likely used in isolation or in simple combinations. Water, danger, go water. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain words regularly appeared together. Certain word orders conveyed different meanings. These patterns became conventions, rules that everyone in the group followed without necessarily being conscious of them. Children played a crucial role in the development of grammar. When children learn language, they don't just memorize what adults say. They extract patterns and create rules, sometimes overgeneralizing them. I goed instead of I went, because the child has learned that past tense is usually formed by adding ed. This ability to extract and systematize patterns is part of what makes human language learning so powerful. In situations where adults speak a pidgin, a simplified contact language with minimal grammar, children exposed to it will spontaneously create a creole, a full language with complete grammar. This happened in Hawaii when children of immigrant plantation workers who spoke different languages and communicated in pidgin developed Hawaiian Creole, a new language with complex grammar that arose in a single generation. This shows that the human brain has an innate capacity to create grammatical structure. Our ancestors' children may have played a similar role. Adults might have used words in simple, ungrammatical ways, but children, with their pattern-finding brains, would have imposed structure, creating rules and regularities. Generation after generation, this process would have made language more complex, more systematic, more powerful. The earliest languages were entirely spoken. There was no writing, no permanent record. Everything was transmitted orally, through speech and memory. This placed limits on what could be communicated. Complex ideas had to be broken into chunks that could be remembered. Stories and knowledge were preserved in forms that aided memory, rhythms, repetitions, formulaic phrases. This is why oral traditions often have a poetic quality, why ancient epics are full of repeated phrases and epithets. These mnemonic devices helped people remember and transmit important information. Language gave humans an unprecedented advantage. It allowed for teaching and learning at a scale impossible for other species. A chimpanzee mother can show her offspring how to crack nuts with stones, but she can't explain why certain stones work better, can't describe a technique for selecting good stones, can't tell stories about the time she found an especially good cracking stone. Humans can do all of this with language. Language allowed for planning. Tomorrow, we will go to the river where the big fish gather, and we will catch them using the woven traps. This sentence references future time, a specific place, a method, a goal. It coordinates actions across individuals and across time. Without language, such coordination would be vastly more difficult. Language allowed for sharing knowledge about things not immediately present. 3 days' walk to the east, there's a place where red ochre can be found in the ground. This information could be transmitted and remembered, allowing others to find the ochre even if they'd never been there. Knowledge could accumulate across generations. Each generation didn't have to rediscover everything. They could build on what came before. Language enabled abstract thought, or at least facilitated it greatly. It's hard to think about concepts like justice or beauty or time without words for them. Language gives us handles for abstract concepts, allowing us to manipulate them mentally, to reason about them, to discuss them with others. This recursive, self-referential quality of language, the ability to talk about talking, to think about thinking, may be unique to humans. Language also created culture in a new sense. Before language, cultural transmission was limited to observable behaviors. After language, entire systems of belief, stories, myths, rituals could be transmitted. A group's identity, their understanding of the world, their values and norms could be encoded in language and passed down through generations. This created diverse cultures, as different groups developed different languages, different stories, different ways of understanding reality. As groups of humans spread across Africa and eventually out into the rest of the world, their languages diverged. Small differences in pronunciation, in vocabulary, in grammatical structures accumulated over generations. Groups that were separated, that no longer interacted regularly, developed increasingly different ways of speaking. Over thousands and tens of thousands of years, these differences grew until what had been dialects of the same language became mutually unintelligible languages. This process of language divergence has been ongoing for as long as humans have had language. It's analogous to biological evolution. Languages change over time, branching into daughter languages, which branch again and again. Linguists can trace these relationships, grouping languages into families that share a common ancestor. The Indo-European language family, for instance, includes English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, and many others, all descended from a common ancestral language spoken thousands of years ago. The earliest archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior, which might indicate language, appears around 100,000 years ago or earlier. Ochre, a red pigment, found at sites in Africa, shows signs of having been processed and used, possibly for body decoration or art. Perforated shells that appear to have been strung as beads appear around 75,000 years ago. These artifacts suggest symbolic thinking, the ability to use one thing to represent another, a cognitive ability closely linked to language. Around 50,000 years ago, there's a dramatic increase in the archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior. Cave paintings appear, depicting animals and humans and abstract symbols. Musical instruments are created from bone and ivory. Elaborate burials suggest beliefs about death and perhaps an afterlife. This has been called the Great Leap Forward or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though whether it represents a sudden change or simply reflects better preservation of artifacts and a larger human population is debated. Some researchers believe this explosion of symbolic artifacts indicates the emergence of fully modern language at this time. The argument is that the kind of abstract, symbolic thinking required to create art, music, and complex tools is the same kind of thinking that language enables and reflects. If humans were creating all these symbolic artifacts, they must have had language rich enough to support such cognition. Others argue that language predates these artifacts by tens of thousands of years or more. The artifacts, they say, reflect not the emergence of language, but a population expansion or changes in social organization or improved preservation of materials or simply a threshold being crossed where enough people were making enough things that some survived to be found by archaeologists. Language, in this view, is much older, perhaps as old as anatomically modern humans themselves, around 200,000 years ago. We may never resolve this debate definitively, but we can be certain that by 40,000 years ago, humans had language in the full modern sense. They were telling stories, passing down knowledge, coordinating complex activities, creating art and music, all of which strongly suggest rich linguistic communication. The languages spoken by our ancestors 40,000 years ago left no direct trace, but we can make some educated guesses about what they might have been like based on reconstructions of ancient languages and on features common to all modern languages. All human languages have ways to refer to time, to indicate past, present, and future. All have ways to negate, to say what is not the case. All have ways to ask questions. All have pronouns, words like I and you and they. These universal features may reflect deep, ancient structures that were present in the earliest languages. Different languages carve up the world in different ways. Some languages have many words for different types of snow or sand, reflecting the importance of these substances in their speakers' environments and lives. Some languages have elaborate kinship terminology, distinguishing between maternal and paternal relatives, between older and younger siblings, reflecting the importance of family relationships in their social structure. Some languages have few color terms, while others have many, suggesting that how we categorize the visual spectrum is partly culturally determined. These differences show that language is not just a neutral medium for expressing pre-existing thoughts. Language shapes thought, at least to some degree. The words and categories your language provides influence what you notice, what you remember, how you reason. This is the linguistic relativity hypothesis, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, after two linguists who explored these ideas. The strong version of this hypothesis, that language completely determines thought, is generally rejected, but a weaker version, that language influences thought in subtle ways, is supported by research. For example, languages differ in how they encode spatial relations. English uses egocentric terms like left and right, which depend on the speaker's perspective. Some languages use absolute terms like north and south, which are independent of perspective. Speakers of absolute languages have been shown to have better orientation abilities and to remember spatial information differently than speakers of egocentric languages. The language you speak influences how you think about space. Similarly, languages differ in how they encode time. English speakers often talk about time using spatial metaphors. We look forward to the future. We put the past behind us. Mandarin speakers can also talk about time vertically. The future is down. The past is up. Studies show that these different metaphors influence how speakers think about time, how quickly they judge temporal sequences, which mental images they form. Language also influences memory. The words you have to describe an event influence how you remember it. If your language forces you to encode certain information, say, whether an action was witnessed directly or heard about, you'll remember that information more accurately than speakers of languages that don't require encoding it. Language acts as a lens, focusing your attention on certain aspects of experience and influencing what you encode in memory. As humans spread across the globe, languages multiplied. By the time of the agricultural revolution around 10,000 years ago, when humans in various parts of the world began domesticating plants and animals and settling into permanent communities, thousands of languages were probably spoken worldwide. Each small group, each tribe, each clan had its own language or dialect. Human linguistic diversity was at its peak. Agriculture changed human life profoundly. It allowed for larger populations, denser settlements, social hierarchies, specialization of labor. It also affected language. With larger communities, languages spoken by more people became more uniform. Dialects of neighboring villages began to merge. At the same time, social stratification created new forms of linguistic variation. The language of elites began to differ from that of common people. Professional jargon developed specialized vocabularies for farmers, potters, builders, priests. Agriculture also created a need for new vocabulary. Words for domesticated plants and animals, words for agricultural practices, planting, harvesting, irrigation, words for stored goods, for trade, for measures and quantities. Languages became more complex in these domains, reflecting the increased complexity of human life. Around 5,000 years ago, a revolutionary invention emerged: writing. The earliest writing systems appeared independently in several places: Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. Initially, writing was not for recording speech, but for accounting. Early cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia record quantities of grain, numbers of livestock, transactions in trade. They are economic documents, not literature or speech written down. But writing systems evolved. Logograms, symbols representing whole words, gave way to or were supplemented by phonetic symbols, representing sounds. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform became more phonetic over time. In Egypt, hieroglyphics combined logograms and phonetic elements. These mixed systems could represent speech more flexibly, recording not just nouns and numbers, but verbs, grammar, complete sentences. The invention of fully phonetic writing, where symbols represent individual sounds rather than words or syllables, was a further breakthrough. The Phoenician alphabet, developed around 3,000 years ago in the Eastern Mediterranean, had about 22 symbols representing consonants. This small set of symbols could represent any word in the language, making writing much easier to learn and use. The alphabet spread, adapted by Greeks who added vowels, then adopted and modified by Romans, giving rise to the Latin alphabet used for English and many other languages today. Writing transformed language and society. For the first time, language could exist independent of a speaker. A text could be written and read by someone far away in space or time. Knowledge could be accumulated and preserved across generations without relying on human memory. Complex ideas could be developed at length, with the writer returning to revise and refine. Laws could be written down, making them explicit and permanent. Literature could be created, stories and poems preserved exactly as their authors intended. But writing was restricted to small elites for most of history. Learning to read and write required years of training. Writing materials, clay tablets, papyrus, parchment, were expensive. The vast majority of people remained illiterate, relying on oral tradition and spoken language for communication and cultural transmission. Spoken language continued to evolve and change. Languages are never static. Every generation speaks slightly differently from the previous one. New words are created or borrowed from other languages. Pronunciations shift gradually. Grammar simplifies in some ways, complexifies in others. Over centuries, these small changes accumulate into large differences. Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, evolved differently in different regions after the empire fell. In Gaul, it became French. In Iberia, Spanish and Portuguese. In Italy, Italian. In Romania, Romanian. These Romance languages are all descendants of Latin, but a speaker of one cannot understand the others without learning them. They have diverged through 1,000 years of separate evolution. English has a particularly complex history. It began as a Germanic language, brought to Britain by Anglo-Saxon invaders in the 5th century. Old English, as we call it, was quite different from modern English, with complex grammar, many noun cases, and vocabulary mostly from Germanic roots. Then the Vikings invaded, bringing Old Norse, which influenced English grammar and vocabulary. Then the Norman conquest in 1066 brought French-speaking rulers to England. For several centuries, French was the language of the court and the elite, while English remained the language of common people. This linguistic situation had profound effects. English vocabulary became a mix of Germanic and Romance words, often with subtle differences in meaning. We have pairs like start, Germanic, and commence, French, buy, Germanic, and purchase, French, where the Germanic word feels informal and the French-derived word formal. English grammar simplified, losing most of the case system and many of the grammatical gender distinctions, possibly influenced by contact with Norse and French. Middle English, spoken from roughly the 11th to 15th centuries, was transitional. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century in Middle English, is recognizable to modern English speakers, but requires effort to read. Pronunciation was quite different. The K in night was pronounced. The final E in many words was sounded. Spelling had not yet been standardized, so the same word might be spelled differently even within the same document. The great vowel shift, occurring roughly between 1400 and 1700, transformed English pronunciation. Long vowels changed systematically, rising in the mouth. This is why English spelling often seems irregular. It reflects pronunciation before the shift, while modern pronunciation reflects after. The word name was once pronounced more like naam, rhyming with modern calm. Early modern English, the language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible, emerged from these changes. By the 16th century, English was recognizably similar to the modern language, though still with differences in vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. The printing press, introduced to England in 1476, began to standardize spelling and grammar, slowing the rate of visible change. The expansion of European empires spread European languages around the world. Spanish and Portuguese spread through Central and South America. English spread to North America, Australia, parts of Africa, and Asia. French spread to parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. These colonial languages often displaced indigenous languages, though indigenous languages have left their mark on colonial languages. Many place names, words for local plants and animals, and sometimes grammatical influences. In the Americas, contact between European colonizers and indigenous peoples created new linguistic situations. Sometimes pidgins developed simplified contact languages for trade. Sometimes indigenous people learned European languages, often losing their own languages in the process. Sometimes European settlers borrowed words from indigenous languages for new things they encountered. Canoe, tobacco, moose, tomato are all words English, borrowed from indigenous American languages. The Atlantic slave trade created another linguistic situation. Enslaved Africans, speaking many different languages, needed to communicate with each other and with their enslavers. In some places, Creoles developed, new languages with grammar created by children from the pidgins their parents spoke. Haitian Creole, based on French, and Jamaican Patois, based on English, are examples. These Creoles are full languages, as complex and expressive as any other, despite their origins in the simplified pidgins of forced migration and oppression. Language has always been tied to power and identity. The language of conquerors often displaces the languages of the conquered. But languages can also resist. Hebrew, for instance, ceased to be an everyday spoken language around 2,000 years ago, existing only as a liturgical language. But in the 20th century, it was deliberately revived as a spoken language in Israel, a remarkable case of language renewal. Irish, Welsh, and many indigenous languages around the world are subjects of revitalization efforts, as communities work to preserve and renew languages that were nearly lost. Today, the world has about 7,000 languages, though the exact number is difficult to determine because the distinction between language and dialect is not always clear. These languages represent an incredible diversity of human expression, different ways of organizing sound and meaning, different strategies for grammar, different ways of carving up experience into categories and words. But this diversity is endangered. Languages are disappearing at an alarming rate. Some estimates suggest that half of the world's languages will disappear by the end of this century. When a language disappears, a unique way of understanding the world is lost. The knowledge encoded in that language about local ecology, about history, about culture, is often lost as well, or at least becomes harder to access. Languages die for various reasons. Sometimes it's because speakers are killed or displaced. Sometimes it's because speakers voluntarily shift to a more dominant language to improve their economic opportunities or to fit in with a larger society. Sometimes it's because children are not taught the language, breaking the chain of transmission. Once a language has no native speakers who learned it as children, it's extremely difficult to revive it fully, though not impossible, as Hebrew shows. Linguists and communities are working to document and preserve endangered languages, recording speakers, creating dictionaries and grammars, developing writing systems for languages that have been oral, teaching the language to children. These efforts aim to maintain linguistic diversity, to honor the cultures and knowledge systems embedded in these languages, and to preserve human heritage. The study of language, linguistics, has revealed that despite surface diversity, all human languages share deep commonalities. All languages have ways to form questions, to negate, to refer to things not present. All have nouns and verbs, though languages divide these categories differently. All have some form of grammatical organization, rules for how words combine into larger structures. These universals suggest that human language capacity is biologically grounded, part of our species' cognitive endowment. Noam Chomsky, one of the most influential linguists of the 20th century, argued that children couldn't learn language from environmental input alone. The stimulus is too impoverished, he argued. Children hear grammatical mistakes, incomplete sentences, false starts, yet they reliably learn the grammar of their language, including rules they've never explicitly heard. Chomsky proposed that humans have an innate, universal grammar, a set of principles and parameters that all human languages follow. Children don't learn language from scratch, but rather set parameters based on the input they hear. This theory has been influential, but also controversial. Critics argue that children may be better at extracting patterns from input than Chomsky assumes, that statistical learning and general cognitive abilities may explain language acquisition without needing to posit innate grammar. They point to computer models that can learn grammatical patterns from exposure to language, suggesting that innate knowledge may not be necessary. The debate continues, but most researchers agree that both innate abilities and environmental input are necessary for language acquisition. Humans are born with some kind of predisposition to learn language, shaped by evolution. But the specific language acquired depends entirely on input. A child will learn whatever language they hear, whether it's English, Mandarin, Swahili, or any other language. And if a child hears no language, if they are severely deprived of linguistic input, they will not develop normal language, showing that input is essential. There have been tragic cases of children severely neglected who grew up without exposure to language. When rescued and given intervention, these children struggle to learn language, especially grammar. There appears to be a critical period for language acquisition. Children who learn a language before puberty generally achieve native-like proficiency. Those who learn after puberty as adults rarely achieve the same level, especially in pronunciation and in intuitive grammatical knowledge. The brain's plasticity for language learning is highest in early childhood and declines with age. This is why immigrant children often speak the new language without an accent, while their parents retain strong accents. The children's brains are still in the critical period for language learning, able to acquire the phonology perfectly. The parents' brains have passed this period, so they map the new language's sounds onto their existing phonological system, leading to an accent. Bilingualism is increasingly common in our globalized world. Contrary to old myths, bilingualism doesn't confuse children or delay language development. Bilingual children may mix languages occasionally, but this is normal and temporary. They separate their languages appropriately by around age 4. In fact, bilingualism provides cognitive benefits. Bilinguals show enhanced executive function, better ability to focus attention, to switch between tasks, to inhibit irrelevant information. Managing 2 languages trains the brain in cognitive control. Technology is transforming language in new ways. Writing was the first major technology of language, making language visible and permanent. Printing made written language available to wider populations. Now, digital technology is enabling new forms of language use. Text messaging, social media, email. These create written language that is more informal, more conversational, more like speech than traditional writing. Texting has been criticized for degrading language with its abbreviations and loose grammar. But linguists point out that texters are highly creative, inventing new forms to convey tone and emotion in text. Emoticons and emojis serve functions similar to facial expressions and tone of voice in spoken conversation. Capitalization, repetition of letters, and punctuation are used expressively. Far from degrading language, digital communication is expanding its expressive range. Translation technology is improving rapidly. Computer programs can now translate between languages with increasing accuracy, using neural networks trained on vast amounts of multilingual text. While these translations are not yet as good as human translators, especially for nuanced or literary text, they are good enough for many practical purposes. This makes information and communication across language barriers easier than ever before. But translation technology also raises concerns. If everyone can communicate through automatic translation, will there be less motivation to learn foreign languages? Will linguistic diversity decline further as dominant languages like English, Chinese, and Spanish become even more dominant because technology favors them? Or will technology help preserve endangered languages by making them more accessible and useful in the modern world? These questions remain open. Artificial intelligence is also learning to produce language. Language models can generate coherent text, answer questions, even write poetry and stories. These systems are trained on enormous amounts of text, learning statistical patterns of word sequences. They don't understand language the way humans do. They have no grounding in the world, no embodied experience, no genuine understanding. But they can produce remarkably fluent text, mimicking human language. This raises philosophical questions. If a machine can produce language indistinguishable from human language, does it have language in the same sense humans do? Does it understand what it's saying? Most researchers say no, that human language is grounded in meaning, in intention, in social interaction, in embodied experience in the world. Machine language is pattern matching, sophisticated, but ultimately different in kind from human language. The future of language is uncertain. Will global languages continue to spread, eventually reducing diversity to a handful of major languages? Or will technology enable small languages to thrive by reducing the economic disadvantages of speaking a minority language? Will human language change fundamentally as we interact more with machines? Or will it remain essentially as it has been, a system for human-to-human communication? Will we enhance language with technology, perhaps even developing brain-computer interfaces that allow more direct communication? These questions will be answered by future generations, but we can be certain that language will continue to change and evolve as it always has, shaped by technology, by social forces, by the creativity and needs of speakers. Language is deeply woven into human identity and culture. The language you speak is part of who you are. It connects you to your family, your community, your cultural heritage. When people lose their ancestral language, they often feel they've lost part of themselves, a connection to their past, to their ancestors, to ways of thinking and being that existed in that language. This is why language preservation is about more than just maintaining diversity for its own sake. It's about respecting human rights, honoring cultural heritage, maintaining connections between generations. When a community's language is lost, often because of forced assimilation or cultural suppression, something valuable is lost, not just for that community, but for humanity as a whole. Languages encode knowledge. Indigenous languages often contain detailed knowledge of local ecology, plants, animals, seasons, landscapes that has been accumulated over thousands of years. This knowledge is encoded in vocabulary, in names for species and places, in stories and traditional practices. When a language disappears, this knowledge often disappears with it, or at least becomes much harder to access. For example, many indigenous languages in the Amazon have elaborate taxonomies of plants, including medicinal plants, whose properties are unknown to Western science. This knowledge is passed down in the language, in traditional names and uses. As these languages disappear, this knowledge is at risk. Scientists have collaborated with indigenous speakers to document this knowledge, recognizing its value. Language also encodes history. Place names often preserve information about the past. The history of English place names reveals successive waves of Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and Viking settlement. A place name ending in "by" indicates Viking origin. It's the Old Norse word for village. A name ending in "chester" or "castor" indicates a Roman fort, from the Latin castra. These linguistic fossils preserve history in the landscape. Stories transmitted in language preserve cultural memory. Oral traditions can maintain historical knowledge for thousands of years. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describe features of the landscape that existed thousands of years ago, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The stories encode this ancient knowledge, passed down through countless generations, preserved in language and narrative. Poetry and literature depend fundamentally on language. Every language has its own poetic traditions, its own rhythms and sounds, its own ways of creating beauty with words. A poem in its original language carries meanings and resonances that are often lost in translation. This is true of all literary art. Shakespeare's plays are brilliant in English, but something is lost in translation. The same is true of Dante in Italian, of Homer in ancient Greek, of the Chinese classics in Chinese. Music and language are deeply connected. Songs combine language and melody, and different languages have different characteristic rhythms and intonations that influence their music. The sound patterns of the language, the distribution of stressed and unstressed syllables, the phonetic qualities of the vowels and consonants, all shape what sounds natural and beautiful in song. Some researchers believe music and language share evolutionary origins, that both emerged from a common proto-language that combined pitch, rhythm, and meaning. Mother-infant communication has musical qualities, the high-pitched melodic baby talk that adults use with infants, the cooing and babbling of babies. Perhaps language and music both emerge from elaborations of these basic communicative melodies. Language allows humans to cooperate at unprecedented scales. We can coordinate actions with people we've never met across vast distances because we can communicate through language. We can form communities based on shared language, shared stories, shared values transmitted through language. This has allowed humans to build complex societies, to create civilizations, to accomplish feats impossible for other species. But language can also divide. Different languages can create barriers between groups. Misunderstanding across language barriers can lead to conflict. Linguistic discrimination, where speakers of certain languages or dialects are looked down upon, can perpetuate inequality. Language has been used as a tool of oppression, with dominant groups suppressing the languages of minorities. In many colonial contexts, indigenous languages were banned in schools. Children were punished for speaking their native languages, forced to learn the colonial language. This was done deliberately to erase indigenous cultures, to assimilate indigenous peoples into the dominant culture. The trauma of this linguistic and cultural suppression continues to affect communities generations later. Today, there's increasing recognition of linguistic rights, the right to use one's own language, to have it respected, to educate one's children in it. Many countries now have policies supporting multilingualism, recognizing multiple official languages, providing education in minority languages. These policies aim to undo historical injustices and to preserve linguistic diversity. Sign languages deserve special mention. These are full human languages, as complex and expressive as spoken languages, but using visual spatial modality instead of auditory vocal. Sign languages have grammar, vocabulary, dialects, poetry, and change over time like spoken languages. They are not simply gestural versions of spoken languages. American Sign Language, for instance, is unrelated to English in its grammar and vocabulary, and is more closely related to French Sign Language because of historical connections. Deaf communities around the world have their own sign languages, which are central to deaf culture and identity. For many deaf people, sign language is not just a communication tool, but a defining feature of their identity, connecting them to deaf community and culture. Efforts to force deaf people to use only spoken language through speech therapy and banning sign language in schools have been harmful, denying deaf people access to a fully natural and accessible language. The recognition that sign languages are full languages, not inferior to spoken languages, came relatively late. For much of history, deaf people were thought to be unable to develop full language and were often denied education. The recognition of sign languages linguistic status has changed this, leading to better education for deaf people and greater respect for deaf culture. Language evolution continues today. New words are constantly being created for new technologies, new concepts, new social phenomena, email, internet, podcast, selfie, emoji. These words didn't exist a few decades ago. They arose because we needed words for new things. Languages are creative, constantly generating new forms. Words can also change meaning over time. Awful once meant full of awe, inspiring awe, but now means terrible. Nice once meant foolish or stupid, from Latin nescius, meaning ignorant. Through a process called semantic shift, words' meanings drift over time, sometimes dramatically. This is a normal process in language evolution. Languages also borrow from each other constantly. English has borrowed words from dozens of languages. Café from French, piano from Italian, algebra from Arabic, tsunami from Japanese. This borrowing enriches the language, providing new words for new concepts or providing stylistic alternatives. Some languages are more resistant to borrowing, preferring to create new words from existing roots. But all languages borrow to some degree. The way we communicate is changing with technology, but the fundamental human need for communication remains the same. We still want to connect with others, to share our thoughts and feelings, to coordinate actions, to tell stories, to express ourselves. The mediums change, from speech to writing, to print to digital. But the core functions persist. Video calls allow us to communicate across vast distances with more richness than text or voice alone, bringing back the visual dimension of face-to-face communication. Social media creates new forms of public discourse, new kinds of communities based on shared interests rather than geographic proximity. Podcasts revive oral storytelling traditions. Each new technology creates new possibilities for language use, but technology can't replace face-to-face human interaction. There's something irreplaceable about being physically present with another person, seeing their expressions, hearing the nuances of their voice, picking up on subtle cues that don't transmit through technology. Language evolved in face-to-face contexts, and that's still where it works most naturally. Children learn language best through interaction with people, not from screens. A child won't learn language from watching television or YouTube, no matter how educational. They need interaction, back and forth exchanges, conversations with responsive adults who adjust their speech to the child's level, who follow the child's attention, who provide feedback. This social dimension of language learning is fundamental. Language is inherently social. It exists between people, not just in individual brains. We learn language through social interaction. We use language to build and maintain relationships. We adjust our language depending on who we're talking to. We speak differently to children than adults, differently to friends than strangers, differently in formal than informal contexts. This social sensitivity is part of linguistic competence. Conversation is the most basic form of language use. Before writing, before broadcasts, there was conversation. Two or more people taking turns speaking, responding to each other, building shared understanding. Conversation seems effortless, but is actually quite complex, requiring rapid processing of what others say, planning what to say next, managing turn-taking, repairing misunderstandings, adjusting to others' needs. We're remarkably good at conversation. We can hold complex discussions about abstract topics, tell long stories, explain complicated ideas, argue and persuade. We can detect subtle implications, understand humor and irony, pick up on what's meant but not said. These abilities, so natural to humans, are enormously difficult to replicate in machines, showing how sophisticated human language really is. Silence is also part of communication. Pauses in speech carry meaning. A silence after a question can indicate reluctance to answer, or thoughtfulness, or disagreement, depending on context. Different cultures have different norms about silence. How long a pause is comfortable, whether silence is awkward or companionable, when silence is respectful. Learning these norms is part of cultural and linguistic competence. Tone of voice carries enormous information beyond the word's literal meaning. The same sentence can express different emotions or attitudes depending on intonation. Thanks can be sincere or sarcastic, depending on how it's said. Languages differ in how they use tone. Some languages, like Mandarin, are tonal, where pitch patterns distinguish different words. Other languages, like English, use intonation for expressing emotion and emphasis, but not for distinguishing word meanings. Gesture accompanies speech in all cultures. We gesture when we talk, using our hands to emphasize points, to depict shapes or actions, to indicate locations. These gestures aren't just decoration. They're integrated with speech, helping us think and communicate. When people can't gesture, for instance, when holding something with both hands, their speech can become less fluent. Gesture is part of language, even if it's not linguistic in the strict sense. Different cultures have different gesture norms. Some cultures gesture more than others. Specific gestures have different meanings. A thumbs up is positive in some cultures, offensive in others. Eye contact norms differ. In some cultures, direct eye contact shows respect and attention. In others, it can be disrespectful. Learning these norms is essential for cross-cultural communication. Humans have a deep need to communicate, to connect through language. Even in extreme isolation, humans create language. Deaf children not exposed to any sign language will create home signs, gestural systems with linguistic structure, to communicate with their families. Isolated communities will develop full languages from minimal input, as happened in Nicaragua, when deaf children brought together in schools created Nicaraguan Sign Language from the rudimentary home signs they brought with them. This drive to communicate, to use language, is part of what makes us human. Other species communicate. Bees dance to indicate flower locations. Birds sing territorial songs. Primates use calls to warn of predators. But no other species has language with the complexity, flexibility, and expressive power of human language. This is one of the most distinctive features of our species. Why did language evolve in humans and not in other intelligent species like dolphins or elephants or great apes? This remains a deep question. Part of the answer may lie in our particular evolutionary history. Humans are intensely social, living in large groups with complex relationships. We have prolonged childhoods requiring extensive parental investment. We cooperate in hunting and gathering, sharing food and knowledge. These social pressures may have driven the evolution of language as a tool for coordination and cultural transmission. Our hands, freed by bipedal walking, allowed us to make and use complex tools. Tool making may have created evolutionary pressure for better communication, to teach others how to make and use tools. The same neural circuits that control fine motor movements of the hands may have been exapted for controlling the fine motor movements of the mouth and throat, needed for speech. Our diet may have played a role. Cooking food made it easier to chew and digest, reducing the size of jaw muscles and creating space in the skull for a larger brain. The larger brain supported more complex cognition, including the cognitive abilities underlying language. These various factors, social, cognitive, anatomical, likely all contributed to language evolution. Language is humanity's most distinctive achievement and most powerful tool. It has allowed us to accumulate knowledge across generations, building on what came before, rather than starting fresh. It has allowed us to coordinate at scales far beyond what's possible for other species. It has allowed us to create art, literature, philosophy, science. It has allowed us to build civilizations, to spread across the globe, to shape the planet. But language also makes us vulnerable to manipulation through propaganda, to conflict through misunderstanding, to division through barriers between language groups. Language can be used to deceive as well as inform, to hurt as well as help. The power of language cuts both ways. As you rest tonight, consider the words flowing through your mind. These words, these sounds that carry meaning, are part of a system millions of years in the making. The biology that allows you to produce and understand speech evolved over evolutionary time. The language you speak emerged over cultural time, changing generation by generation. And the specific words you know, the unique way you use language, developed over your own lifetime, shaped by everyone you've talked to, everything you've read, every conversation you've had. Language connects you to humanity across time and space. The sounds you make when you speak are similar to sounds humans were making thousands of years ago. The need to communicate, to connect, to share is universal. When you speak, you're participating in something ancient and ongoing, something that makes you fully human. The words you know number in the tens of thousands. You learned most of them effortlessly, without conscious study, simply by hearing them used in context. This remarkable ability to learn words continues throughout life, though it's strongest in childhood. Every day you might encounter a new word, infer its meaning from context, and add it to your mental lexicon. This lexicon, your mental dictionary, is organized in complex ways, by sound, by meaning, by grammatical category, allowing you to find the right word rapidly when you need it. How do you know what word to use? This process happens so quickly and automatically that you're not usually aware of it, but it involves searching through your lexicon, selecting words that fit the meaning you want to express, and the grammatical structure you're building, retrieving their sounds and preparing the motor commands to produce them. All of this happens in fractions of a second, usually without error. When errors do occur, saying the wrong word, stumbling over pronunciation, it's often because competing words are activated simultaneously. You also know the rules for combining words, the grammar of your language, though you may not be able to state these rules explicitly. You know that the dog bit the man and the man bit the dog have different meanings. because of word order. You know that the dogs are barking requires the plural marker and the plural form of the verb. You know countless subtle rules about when to use different forms, about what sounds natural and what doesn't. This implicit grammatical knowledge guides your speech and comprehension. When you hear a sentence, you automatically parse it, assigning words to grammatical categories, building a structure that reveals the sentence's meaning. When you speak, you automatically apply grammatical rules, selecting appropriate forms without conscious thought. This unconscious, automatic nature of linguistic knowledge is remarkable. Errors in speech and comprehension can reveal how language processing works. Speech errors, slips of the tongue, often involve exchanging sounds or words in systematic ways, suggesting that language production involves independent levels of processing. Mishearing or misunderstanding can reveal expectations. We often hear what we expect to hear rather than what was actually said, showing that comprehension is active construction, not passive reception. Ambiguous sentences where the same words can be interpreted different ways show that language processing involves resolving ambiguity using context and world knowledge. I saw the man with the telescope could mean I used a telescope to see the man, or I saw a man who had a telescope. Your brain quickly selects the most likely interpretation based on context, usually without conscious awareness of the ambiguity. Metaphor is pervasive in language. We constantly use figurative language. Time flies. Ideas are bright. Argument is war. These metaphors shape how we think. When we talk about time as a resource that can be spent or saved, we think about time differently than cultures that use different metaphors. Metaphor is not just decoration, but a fundamental part of how language works, how we extend meaning from concrete domains to abstract ones. Idioms are phrases whose meaning can't be derived from the individual words. Kick the bucket, spill the beans, let the cat out of the bag. Every language has idioms, and they're often opaque to non-native speakers, even if they know all the individual words. Learning idioms is part of achieving fluency, understanding the conventional expressions that native speakers use. Pragmatics is the study of how context affects meaning. The literal meaning of words is only part of what's communicated. Can you pass the salt? Is literally a question about ability, but is understood as a request. It's hot in here might be an indirect request to open a window. Understanding these indirect meanings requires knowing social conventions and inferring intentions. Politeness is encoded in language in complex ways. Many languages have formal and informal forms of address, used depending on the relationship between speakers. In English, politeness is expressed through indirectness, hedging, using questions rather than commands. Would you mind closing the door? Is more polite than close the door, even though both communicate the same basic request. Language and thought are intimately connected, though the exact nature of the relationship is debated. Do we think in language? Sometimes yes, when you're having an internal monologue, rehearsing what to say, working through a problem in words. But sometimes thought is non-linguistic, visual imagery, spatial reasoning, intuitions that are hard to put into words. Language facilitates certain kinds of thinking, especially abstract reasoning, but isn't necessary for all thought. Different languages make certain distinctions obligatory. Russian requires speakers to distinguish light blue and dark blue with different basic color terms, while English uses a single term blue with optional modifiers. Does this mean Russian speakers perceive blue shades differently? Research suggests slight effects. Russian speakers can distinguish blue shades slightly faster, especially when the distinction is linguistically encoded, but they don't see different colors. They just notice the distinction more readily. The question of whether language shapes perception and cognition is complex. Strong effects seem limited to domains where language provides organizing structure, categories, spatial relations, time concepts. In these domains, the language you speak can influence what you notice, remember, and reason about. But you can learn to think in new ways, to adopt categories from other languages. Language influences but doesn't imprison thought. Multilingual people sometimes report thinking differently in different languages, feeling like different people, depending on which language they're using. Research supports this. Bilinguals show slightly different personality patterns in different languages, possibly because each language is associated with different cultural contexts and social norms. The language you speak activates associated cultural knowledge and may shift your thinking patterns subtly. Language learning as an adult is different from childhood language acquisition. Adults learn explicitly, studying grammar rules and vocabulary lists. Children learn implicitly, extracting patterns from exposure. Adults can draw on their existing language knowledge, comparing and contrasting languages, but adults struggle with pronunciation and with developing native-like intuitions about grammar. Despite these differences, adult language learning is possible and worthwhile. Learning a second language provides cognitive benefits, practical advantages, and cultural enrichment. It opens access to different perspectives, different ways of thinking about the world. Even modest proficiency allows meaningful communication and demonstrates respect for others' cultures. The process of language learning reveals aspects of language we take for granted as native speakers. When you learn a foreign language, you become aware of grammatical structures you use automatically in your native language. You notice that other languages organize experience differently, that they have concepts your language lacks, or vice versa. This metalinguistic awareness enhances understanding of language in general. As you drift towards sleep tonight, your mind continues processing language. Even in dreams, language persists. Some dreams involve conversations, though dream speech is often strange. You might know what someone said without remembering the actual words, or the words might shift and change as you try to recall them. The brain's language systems remain somewhat active during sleep, processing and consolidating linguistic memories. The language you speak is part of who you are. It shapes your thoughts to some degree, connects you to your community, carries your cultural heritage. When you speak, you're using a system that has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years biologically and thousands of years culturally. You're participating in something ancient and ongoing, something uniquely human. Think of all the words you've spoken in your life, millions of them, each one chosen from your mental lexicon, combined with others according to grammatical rules. produced by precisely coordinated movements of tongue, lips, and vocal cords, each one understood by others, conveying meaning, creating shared understanding, building relationships. Think of all the conversations you've had with family, with friends, with colleagues, with strangers. Each conversation a joint activity, a dance of taking turns, building on what each other says, adjusting to maintain understanding. Through these conversations, you've learned, taught, planned, argued, joked, comforted, bonded. Language has been the medium for your social life. Think of all the books you've read, the stories you've heard. Through language preserved in writing, you've accessed minds distant in time and space. You've learned from people long dead, from people on the other side of the world. You've visited imaginary worlds created by fiction writers. You've encountered ideas that changed how you think. All of this mediated by language, by marks on pages that trigger meaning in your mind. Language is a gift, passed down through countless generations. Your parents and caregivers taught you to speak by talking to you, by responding to your attempts, by providing the linguistic environment you needed to develop language naturally. Others taught you to read and write, opening access to preserved language. Teachers expanded your vocabulary, refined your grammar, introduced you to literature. Everyone you've talked to has contributed to your language, adding words, phrases, expressions to your repertoire. And you've passed language on. If you have children, you've taught them to speak, providing the input they needed, responding to their attempts, celebrating their first words and sentences. If you've taught others, you've passed on knowledge through language. In every conversation, you're participating in cultural transmission, sharing information, perspectives, stories. Language evolves through use. Every time you speak, you're potentially contributing to language change. When you adopt a new word or expression, spread a new usage, create a novel combination, you're participating in linguistic innovation. Most of these innovations don't spread. Language is mostly conservative, resistant to change. But occasionally, an innovation catches on, spreading through a community, eventually becoming part of the language. You're living through linguistic change right now. The English you speak today differs from the English of 50 years ago and will differ from the English of 50 years hence. New words appear, old words fall out of use, pronunciations shift, meanings change. You probably don't notice most of these changes. They're too gradual, too subtle, but they're happening continuously, generation by generation. Future English will be different from today's English. Some changes we can predict. Technology will introduce new vocabulary. Globalization will increase borrowing from other languages. Demographic shifts will influence which varieties of English are most influential. But many changes are unpredictable, emerging from the complex dynamics of language in use by millions of speakers. Perhaps in the future, artificial intelligence will transform how we use language. Perhaps translation will become so good that language barriers effectively disappear. Perhaps brain-computer interfaces will allow direct mind-to-mind communication, bypassing language altogether. Or perhaps language will remain fundamentally as it is, the primary medium for human communication, adapted to new technologies, but essentially unchanged. Regardless of how technology changes, the human need for communication will remain. We're social creatures who need to connect with others, to share our inner lives, to coordinate our actions. Language, in whatever form it takes, will continue to serve these needs. It's too fundamental to human nature to disappear or be replaced. The story of language is the story of humanity. Language made us what we are, enabled our cultures, our knowledge, our civilizations. It allowed our ancestors to cooperate, to pass down knowledge, to tell stories that preserved cultural memory. It allowed the development of science, philosophy, literature, all the intellectual achievements of our species. And language continues this work today. Through language, you learn about the world, form relationships, express yourself, participate in society. Through language, humanity continues to accumulate knowledge, to create art, to grapple with the great questions of existence. Language is the medium of human culture, the tool that makes almost everything distinctively human possible. As you rest, let language rest too. The constant flow of words through your mind, the inner monologue that accompanies your waking hours, can quiet now. Your brain doesn't need words to maintain your breathing, to regulate your heartbeat, to cycle through sleep stages. These ancient functions predate language, operating beneath the level of words. In sleep, you'll dream, and in dreams, language often plays a role. But dream language is different, looser, more associative, less constrained by grammar and meaning. Dreams might process linguistic memories, replaying conversations, working through communication. Or dreams might happen in a pre-linguistic mode, in images and emotions that resist translation into words. Tomorrow, language will return. You'll wake and words will flood back. Plans for the day in verbal form, conversations you need to have, things you need to say. Your inner monologue will resume. You'll speak and listen, read and write, using language to navigate your day. Language will be there, reliable and familiar, the medium through which you engage with the world. But tonight, rest. Let the story of language, this long journey from the first words to the vast linguistic diversity of today, settle in your mind. You're part of this story, a speaker in an unbroken chain of speakers, stretching back to the origin of language. You carry language forward, using it, changing it slightly, passing it on. The words exist in your mind, in your memory, ready to be used. But for now, they can rest. You can rest. Sleep well, knowing that language will be there tomorrow, ready to serve you, connecting you to others, enabling you to think and communicate and be fully human. Rest smarter by allowing your mind to settle into the quiet that underlies all words, the silence from which language emerges and to which it returns. Language is a miracle we experience every day without noticing. The ability to turn thoughts into sounds, to send those sounds through the air, to have another person's brain decode them back into thoughts. This is extraordinary when you pause to consider it. We take it for granted because it's so natural to us, but it's actually an amazing feat of biological and cultural evolution. The complexity of what your brain does when you speak is staggering. It plans the meaning you want to convey, selects appropriate words from your lexicon of tens of thousands, arranges them according to grammatical rules, converts them into a sequence of speech sounds, and issues motor commands to dozens of muscles to produce those sounds. All of this happens in real time, at a rate of about 150 words per minute in normal conversation, usually without errors or conscious effort. Listening is equally complex. Your ear converts sound waves into neural signals. Your auditory cortex analyzes these signals, segmenting the continuous stream of sound into discrete words, a non-trivial task given that people don't pause between words when speaking naturally. Your brain accesses word meanings, applies grammatical rules to determine the structure of the sentence, uses context and world knowledge to resolve ambiguities, and constructs an understanding of the speaker's intended meaning. Again, all of this happens rapidly and automatically. The fact that this works at all is remarkable. The fact that it usually works smoothly, allowing rich communication between people, is even more remarkable. Sometimes we marvel at human achievements, technology, art, science, but perhaps our most impressive achievement is one we accomplish every day without thinking about it. Successful communication through language. Language connects minds. When you speak, you're causing another person's brain to represent something similar to what your brain represents. Your thoughts, encoded in words, are decoded by their brain back into thoughts. The match isn't perfect. Communication is always partial, always approximate. But it's often good enough for practical purposes and sometimes achieves real understanding, real connection. This connection through language is part of what makes life meaningful. Sharing your thoughts and feelings with others, understanding their perspectives, collaborating on shared projects, telling stories, making jokes, expressing affection. All of this depends on language. Relationships are built and maintained through linguistic communication. Love, friendship, community, all are mediated by language to a large extent. Language also connects you to yourself. Your inner monologue, the voice in your head, uses language to organize your thoughts, to reason through problems, to rehearse what you'll say, to comment on your experiences. This linguistic thinking may contribute to self-awareness, to the sense of having a unified self that persists through time. The narrative you tell yourself about who you are is formulated in language. But language isn't everything. There are forms of experience that resist linguistic capture. Ineffable feelings, the taste of wine, the beauty of music, the direct experience of being. Language can gesture toward these experiences, can try to describe them, but the description never fully captures the experience itself. Some things must be experienced directly, not mediated by words. This gap between experience and language is both a limitation and a freedom. Language can't capture everything, but this means there's always more to experience than can be said. Mystery remains. Not everything can be reduced to words. This is frustrating when you're trying to communicate something subtle or profound, but it's also reassuring. There's depth to existence that exceeds our ability to talk about it. Different languages handle this gap differently. Some languages have words for experiences that other languages lack. German Schadenfreude, pleasure at others' misfortune. Japanese wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection and impermanence. These words point to experiences that speakers of other languages also have, but don't have specific words for. Having the word might make the experience more salient, easier to think about and discuss. But the experience exists regardless of whether you have a word for it. This is comforting in a way. It means that human experience is universal at some level, transcending language. We all experience joy and sorrow, love and loss, beauty and pain. We all watch sunsets and feel moved by music. Language lets us share these experiences, to connect over them. But the experiences themselves exist beyond language, in direct contact with the world. As you settle into sleep, language fades. The flow of words slows and stops. Your mind shifts into different modes: visual imagery, vague feelings, fragmented thoughts that don't take verbal form. This is restful. The constant linguistic processing of waking life takes energy. Letting it go, allowing non-linguistic modes of experience, is part of what makes sleep restorative. Your brain continues working through the night, but differently. Memories are consolidated, including linguistic memories, strengthening your knowledge of words and grammar. Dreams occur, some linguistic, some not. Neural connections are adjusted, preparing your brain for another day of processing language. Tomorrow, when you wake, language will return effortlessly. You'll transition from the wordless state of sleep to the word-filled state of waking. Your inner monologue will start up. You'll plan your day in words. You'll speak to others. You'll use language to navigate the world as you do every day. But tonight, you can rest in the silence beneath language. Before there were words, before humans spoke, there was just being, just experiencing the world directly, without language to mediate it. That mode of being still exists in you, beneath the constant flow of words. In sleep, you return to it, to the wordless depths of consciousness. Language is a powerful tool, but you are more than language. You're an embodied being, interacting with the world through all your senses, feeling and moving and experiencing. Language helps you make sense of this experience, to share it with others. But the experience itself is primary. The world was here before words, and part of you is still in direct contact with that wordless world. Rest in that contact tonight. Feel your body breathing, your heart beating. Notice sensations, the softness of your bed, the temperature of the air, sounds in the distance. These experiences don't need words. They exist in themselves, before and beyond language. This is where you began, as an infant before language, and this is where you return in sleep, to wordless being. Language will be there tomorrow, ready to serve you. But tonight, you don't need it. You can let it go. Let the words fade away. Let your mind rest in silence. This is part of the rhythm of human existence, the alternation between language and silence, between social connection and solitary rest, between the word-filled day and the wordless night. Sleep well. Rest in the quiet. Let your brain do its nighttime work of consolidating memories and clearing metabolic waste. Let your body recover. Let your mind wander through dreams, linguistic and otherwise. Tomorrow brings new words, new conversations, new opportunities to use this remarkable human ability. But tonight, rest smarter by settling into the peaceful silence that underlies all language. The story of language continues. It began hundreds of thousands of years ago with the first words, and it continues now with every word you speak. You're part of this ongoing story, a temporary bearer of language, passing it on to others even as you use it for your own purposes. This is the human condition, to live in language, to be shaped by it and to shape it, to participate in this collective cultural creation that defines our species. But you're also more than language. More than words, you're a living being embedded in the world, experiencing existence directly. Language enriches this experience, allows you to share it, to think about it in new ways. But the experience itself is primary. Never lose touch with the wordless core of being, the direct contact with life that exists before and beyond language. Rest now in that wordless core. Sleep peacefully, knowing that language will return tomorrow, but that tonight you can rest in silence. Let the story of language fade into the background. Let your thoughts grow quiet. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of night. Wishing you peaceful dreams, restful sleep, and the comfort of silence. Thank you for listening with Sleepy Facts. Let your breath steady. Let your thoughts grow quiet. Rest smarter by allowing your mind to settle into the rhythm of night. If you enjoyed this moment of calm, you are welcome to subscribe. And if there is a topic you want to hear next, simply leave it in the comments. Wishing you a peaceful night and gentle dreams.